Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the School for School Counselors podcast. As always, I'm your host, Steph Johnson. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit more about burnout. Now, why am I harping so much on the burnout piece? Well, as I told you a few episodes ago, we're seeing so much talk about burnout and overwhelm so much earlier in the year than we normally do. And so I really want to get proactive with this. I really want to start the conversation early because it seems as though we really need to have it. And we know that since 2020, we keep thinking every year, gosh, it's going to get easier next year. Next school year is going to be better. And so far, we just keep climbing up to this crescendo of needs, right? And no one really knows when the pendulum is going to swing the other direction. It is draining. It is overwhelming. And if you are not in a healthy environment, meaning your school culture is not good, your administrative culture is not good, it's going to wear you down. And you're human. It's going to happen. So the best thing that we can do is to not only try to set ourselves up for success, which is what we did in the last episode by identifying our burnout personality types, our tendencies, and some things that we can do to try to insulate ourselves from the effects of overwhelm. Today, I want to talk about the types of burnout that people can experience. And again, even if you don't feel like you're to that point, there's still a lot to be learned from this. There's still a lot of preventative factors that you can pick up through the conversation. So I hope you'll join me because it's super, super interesting. Now, overall, there are 3 types of burnout. 2 of them, I would say, are probably the most prevalent in our field. And then there's one that I would venture to say hardly ever applies to us. So let me tell you more about what I mean. The 3 types of burnout are overload, sometimes also called frenetic burnout. Then there can be under challenge or neglect. All right, so I think we can all agree that being under challenged in our school counseling work is not a threat, right? Unless you're just working on an extremely healthy, very low student to counselor ratio campus, that's probably not a consideration in your world. Under challenge is when you feel bored, you feel understimulated, maybe unappreciated, and you really feel like you're lacking meaningful opportunities in your work. I would venture to say very few of us ever approach that state of being. I think the other 2 are much more common in school counseling. Overload burnout or frenetic burnout is characterized by people who are overwhelmed, they're working hard, and then they just start working harder and harder and harder and harder. These are the people that are seen as highly dedicated school counselors. They can be perfectionistic. They want to get everything just right and kind of experience that spotlight effect. Have you heard me talk about that before? The spotlight effect is when you feel like all eyes are on you, judging your performance. I talk about it often with regard to behavior intervention because that's when I've personally felt it the strongest, and I get called in to help a student regulate and feel like everybody's standing in the hallway watching what I'm doing, right? And evaluating my approach or evaluating the outcome. I had a hard time with that at the beginning of my career. This spotlight effect, though, can manifest itself in a lot of different situations, but at its core, it's just that fear of being judged, right? That fear of being evaluated by others, particularly when they don't do what you do for a living. And when you're in overload burnout, you get to where you feel exhausted, right? Just from keeping all of the plates in the air all the time, it just becomes exhausting and overwhelming. When people get to that point, they tend to cope either by venting to others, so complaining, talking about how tired they are all the time, talking about how overwhelmed they are all the time. I'll bet you've probably worked with someone like that in your past. That every time you talk to them, it's just, oh my gosh, I just can't believe how tired I am. This is so overwhelming. I'm never going to get to all these things. How is this even possible, right? Or they tend to problem solve and create more and more work for themselves, create more responsibility for themselves in an effort to fix whatever they think the problem might be. They're going to lead themselves to more overwhelm in the long run, but they don't know what else to do to fix it other than just fixing it. And so it becomes this never-ending cycle that can't be resolved. Overload burnout is going to benefit from developing stronger emotional regulation skills. And that feels so funny to say to school counselors, but we know that we often forget to apply the things that we teach to our students to ourselves. And so we've really got to make sure that we are good at naming and processing our own emotions, about really being mindful of our emotional states and what led us there. We've also got to get really good at reframing our negative self-talk. It's inevitable that that sneaks in, right? Especially when we're in overwhelm, especially when we're nearing burnout. We've got to be really mindful of reframing any negative self-talk that creeps in there, because it's just going to perpetuate that cycle of overwhelm, that cycle of complaining, that cycle of cynicism. We want to stop all of that stuff. So reframing that talk, naming our emotions, processing them well, and developing better emotional regulation for ourselves is going to go a long way to not only resolving or preventing burnout, but it's going to help us better serve our students. The other kind of burnout that we see often in school counseling is something called neglect burnout. And this one sounds really strange because who's neglecting us, right? If nothing, they're overutilizing us, not neglecting us. But neglect burnout doesn't mean that no one's paying attention to you. Neglect burnout refers to work environments where you feel like you don't have enough structure, you don't feel like you get enough direction or guidance in the workplace, and so you really don't know what's going on. It may be a work environment where you're given very little information on what to do, but then once you implement something, you're questioned on it, or it's criticized, or it's critiqued, and you think, well, they didn't care when they told me to do this. Why do they care now? They're constantly second guessing me. They're constantly telling me to change things, that I didn't do it right, but they didn't tell me how to do it in the first place. That's neglect. Over time, that can lead folks to feel incompetent, frustrated, uncertain, not only in their job role, but in their own skills. And then that tends to lead to learned helplessness. Feel like you're incapable of making the right moves, incapable of making a positive influence on your students. And so then you just become really passive. You stop trying. What's the point of this anyway? It's never going to be right. It's never going to make a difference. And then you feel demoralized. And every day that it's time to return to work, you're just kind of trudging in begrudgingly because what's the freaking point anyway? You ever felt like that? So to address neglect burnout, the studies say, number one, you've got to create a to-don't list. So not a to-do list, but a to-don't list. You have got to find the place that you feel the most intense resentment, the most confusion about what you do, and you need to avoid those as much as possible. Create some really solid and healthy boundaries for yourself. Separate that work from your home time. Make sure there's a clear delineation. I'll tell you, I have a ritual every day at the end of the day, and I do this very intentionally. It is a small gesture. It is very simple, but to me, it signals my workday is done. So at the end of the day, I take my badge off. I most often have it clipped to my collar. I take my badge off. I take my keys and clip them to my badge, and I put them in my bag. And then once I've done that thing, once I've completed that ritual, which, like I said, it's simple, but to me, that signals the end of the workday is here. I don't need to worry about this anymore. I'm no longer on campus. I will pick it up again tomorrow. This starts my time. You might want to look into creating some rituals like that for yourself, just to really mark the end of your workday so that things aren't bleeding over into each other. Does that make sense? Advocating for your role is going to be very important in situations of neglect burnout or potential neglect burnout, because we've got to advocate and educate our administrators on what our roles are and what you're capable of. Often they just don't know. They may have come up through educational administration before we really saw this big push toward social emotional learning and mental health in schools back, when we were guidance counselors and nothing else. So you've got to educate your folks. First, we've got to get you to where you're feeling strong enough to do that. And we're building a framework for advocacy for you. So stay tuned for that, because I think it's going to be really powerful. And then the last thing, if you're worrying about neglect burnout, is focusing on what you can control. So again, another skill we teach our students. One is within your realm of control and one is outside of it, and really focusing on that self-care piece. We talked about that in the last episode, about how a lot of these common suggestions for self-care are not helpful. But if you can identify your burnout personality type, you can craft a plan to help you avoid burnout a little better by really being intentional about your self-care activities and not just going and getting a pedicure and then counting it as, check that box off. I got my self-care box checked this week. That's not what that is. So go back and give that a listen if you haven't already. Find your burnout personality type and then really be intentional about the things you put into place because of it. So in all of this, and trying to be preventative with good self-care strategies that are realistic and are actually useful, right? And then identifying your burnout type or potential burnout type. We also need to know where we fall in the burnout process. There are distinct stages to burnout, and so I'm going to touch on them briefly. Now, we could talk for hours and hours and days and weeks and months on this, but just as a quick synopsis, let me kind of summarize the stages of burnout for you. First is the honeymoon phase. That's when you have a lot of energy and optimism for your work. You're a go-getter. There's rainbows and butterflies every time you turn a corner. You feel a lot of satisfaction in your work. You feel productive. You feel creative, like nothing could be better. It's often what we imagine when we embark on our school counseling jobs, right? We have these grand ideas of these comprehensive programs and all these great things we're going to implement inside of them, and nothing is going to sway us from building the best counseling program ever. Then we get to the onset of stress phase. It's where you start to have stress take over, but not all the time. It just takes over in these little pockets of time here and there. And it takes over to the point that you might start to notice some physical differences or some mental differences. Perhaps you're losing focus a little bit more easily than you normally do. You're feeling less productive. You're having trouble sleeping, those kinds of things. So you're not walking around all the time feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm so stressed, I'm never going to be able to crawl out of this hole. But you do have those times where you do feel overwhelmed. The stress is taking over here and there, and it's starting to cause these physical and mental manifestations. And then if the cycle continues, You move into the chronic stress phase. That's where your stress is more consistent. You perhaps start to feel apathy toward your work, right? Because it's just so stinking stressful. You get to the point that you don't care anymore because you don't feel like you're ever going to feel good. You may start being late for work, procrastinating with your tasks or your deadlines, and you might start to really withdraw. If people at work are having conversations, you're not being a part of those anymore. You're not initiating any extra conversations. You're starting to show anger. You're just mad because the stress is just killing you. And this may also be the point at which your work stress starts to bleed into your personal life. That's when we know we're getting in the danger zone, right? When we cannot keep the two separate and that workplace stress starts to affect us at home. It starts to affect our interactions with our families, with our friends. We don't want to go out in our community because we're just so damn mad all the time. That's when we know we've got a problem. And then the last phase is the burnout phase. This is when you become just almost obsessive about all the problems that you perceive at work. You feel mentally exhausted. You may feel physically exhausted and very numb, almost indifferent to what's happening around you at work, perhaps very cynical. Some people are cynical by nature, but if you're feeling more cynical than usual, if you're starting to put that out into the world, that can be a hint that you've entered the burnout phase. You're also going to experience some reduced accomplishments, reduced job performance. You're not going to find it fun anymore. It's not going to be satisfying to do your work anymore. Your creativity goes out the window. You can't concentrate on anything anymore. It's almost just like you're existing within your job framework. You may begin to develop physical symptoms as well, chronic headaches, stomach issues, GI issues, all that kind of stuff. We know that stress affects our body physically so often. This is the point at which you have probably gone past the point of remedying the situation yourself. You are probably going to have to be looking at perhaps some therapy to help you sort some things out, perhaps a job change, perhaps a change of placement, something like that, in order to get through this and get back down toward the honeymoon phase, right? That's where we want to be working, in the honeymoon and the stress onset, where it's here and there. That's where we want to be. If you let this go long enough, you're going to enter into habitual burnout. That's when you become burnt out in every aspect of your life. Your work life has bled over into your personal life. You no longer distinguish between the two. Everything just sucks, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. This obviously can lead to some severe anxiety and depression, and it's definitely time to seek some outside help. Hopefully, we don't have anybody listening that's gotten to that point yet, but if you're feeling that way, I'm going to encourage you, go get some support. You're going to need it. Go get some short-term counseling, check into your school district benefits, see if you have an employee assistance program perhaps that can provide some free or reduced rate counseling. Take care of yourself, because once you get to that stage of burnout, it's not going to resolve itself. You're going to have to do some work to crawl out of it. All right, well, we ended that one on kind of a bummer, right, with this burnout phase and habitual burnout. But I think it's important for us to recognize not only where we are within that burnout framework, but also the potential. If we don't step in, if we're not intentional with what we do, how we think, how we treat ourselves, what the repercussions of that can be. Y'all, I'm going to be real. This field is not for the faint of heart. Working in education, particularly these days, is extremely difficult. And school counseling, I think even more so, because we have so many other constraints tying our hands behind our backs than other positions on our campuses. We have confidentiality concerns. We have concerns with making clinical judgments and referring students out. We have a lot of weight on our shoulders with all those things. And we're typically not restricted to just one focus, right? We're never just restricted to academic counseling or behavior intervention or social emotional learning or mental health. It's all the things all the time, and they bleed into and morph in and out of each other, and it gets really complicated. This is a hard job, but I'm here to tell you it's also one of the most rewarding. And if you've been working in a place that's just not healthy, if you've been working in an environment that's leading toward your burnout, I'm going to encourage you to really take a hard look at not only the outside factors that are causing that, but the internal factors as well. What can you do to support yourself through that process until you make a decision on what happens next? One of the best things that you can do is get some good professional consultation and support. I talk about this all the time because I'm such a stinking believer in it. And if you know any clinical counselors in your area, you know that they invest in consultation quite often. As a matter of fact, it's an ethical mandate that they do so. It needs to be the same for our field as well. There's so much that we carry on our shoulders. There's so much information that we are entrusted to hold. And there are so many imbalances and abuses of power in our educational system that sometimes it gets really, really difficult to navigate. So I want you to know, if you haven't found a good support and consultation group, y'all, we've got one for you. School for School Counselors Mastermind was built precisely for this, to be a support, to be a think tank of ideas, of thoughts, of approaches for managing this stress and burnout, but also to be a sounding board. If you just need to be heard, and you just need to know you're not the only one, we can do that too. You can check it out at schoolforschoolcounselors.com/mastermind. We would love to join you. We have a seat waiting for you at the table each and every week, and we would love to welcome you into our mastermind community. It is full of phenomenal professional school counselors. It's just an amazing experience and something that I hope you all get to be a part of at some point in your career. So again, check that out, schoolforschoolcounselors.com/mastermind. If you need a professional support and consultation group that can help guide you through the intricacies of the work, through your questions, through your wonderings, we can do all of that. All right. So I hope you've enjoyed this series on burnout. Like I said, it's kind of a downer in a way, but it's good to know the approaches that we can use to keep burnout at bay, to keep ourselves healthy, to keep ourselves productive for our campuses, our students, and our staff. We're going to be talking a lot more about burnout in our mastermind community as well, because it's just such a hot topic, so important for us to know about. And it's just so intricate, so many nuances to it. So if you'd like to join that conversation too, join us in the mastermind. We'd love to have you. I'll be back next week for another episode of the School for School Counselors podcast. Until then, I hope you have the best week ever. Y'all take care.